Hello and welcome back to the LTL Mandarin School YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about moving to Singapore. Before we get started, we'd love to know on a scale of 1 to 10 how likely you are to move to Singapore. Maybe that number will be a little bit higher after this video. I certainly hope so. As always, please like this video, subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Okay, let's get started. Roll the intro. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about when moving to Singapore are the languages of Singapore. We are a Mandarin school. Obviously, we think you should learn any language of the country that you're going to. However, almost all Singaporeans are bilingual. Most of them are native in their own language. These are either Mandarin Chinese, Malay or Tamil, and most learn English as second language. All young Singaporeans are bilingual. In fact, most of the island does speak English. So don't worry when you're moving here. Most people, if not everyone, will be able to understand what you're saying. The second thing you should know when moving to Singapore is that Singapore is in the tropics. In fact, look it up right now on Google and you can see just how close Singapore is to the equator. So it's hot and humid all year round, and it will be particularly wet during the wet season. If you're moving to Singapore, you're going to need an employment pass by the Ministry of Manpower. Now don't worry, this doesn't involve too much. Your employers will take care of everything, but the first thing you want to do is secure employment in Singapore. Alternatively, maybe your partner is finding work in Singapore and has found a job, at which point you can apply for a dependent pass so you can still live with your loved one. The next thing you should know about is the tax rate. Now, Singapore has a relatively low income tax, which is fantastic. If you're here earning money, you're going to be paying less tax probably than what you would have been doing at home. However, there is a goods and services tax applied to almost everything here in Singapore. Singapore is notoriously expensive, and these taxes are certainly a part of that. Singapore is a small island, so everything is imported here, so most things do have this import tax on it. If you're like myself and you like a bit of wine, a bit of cheese, maybe some meat, these are all going to be particularly expensive imported items, and you might want to change your diet to fit accordingly if you want to have a slightly cheaper lifestyle in Singapore. The next thing you're probably going to want to know about before moving to Singapore is a little bit about the accommodation. When you come to Singapore, there are going to be 3 different options when it comes to your accommodation. The first is going to be a house. These are pretty ordinary. Houses do exist in Singapore. You might not believe that if you looked at the skyline. There's mostly high-rise buildings, but a few homes do exist. This would definitely be the most expensive option when looking for accommodation in Singapore. Your second option is going to be a condominium, or they're called condos for short. Condos are very lovely. They're usually serviced apartments, so there's usually a security guard at the front, a pool, tennis courts, perhaps even a gymnasium. So condos are a really good option. This is still quite an expensive choice for accommodation in Singapore. The third option is something known as HDB, so these stand for the Housing Development Board. HDBs are subsidized government housing. So these are apartments that have been built by the government. They actually sell them to Singaporeans for much cheaper than perhaps private companies would. So these can be significantly cheaper than if you were living in condominiums or in a house. HDBs are just as good as anything else you could hope to live in. In fact, I'm in one right now. They're lovely, they're relatively cheap compared to the other accommodation options. But yes, I would certainly recommend starting with HDBs when you're looking at your accommodation options. If you'd like to learn a little bit more, below there is a link to a blog about all these tips for moving to Singapore, and in it you'll find a link to search all the accommodation options here in Singapore. The next thing you're going to want to do some research into before moving to Singapore is healthcare. One of the first things you'll see that the healthcare in Singapore is world class. It is some of the best facilities and doctors in the entire world. You will be looked after very well if you God forbid, get sick or injured here in Singapore. It can be expensive, so it's worth looking at different health insurance options. The next thing you want to know before moving to Singapore is a little bit about the public transport. Now, take it from me, I've been to a few countries and I've never seen better public transport than in Singapore. The buses and the trains are very clean, they're air conditioned, they come regularly, they go all over the island. It is a fantastic service that's run here. One of the reasons it's so good is because Singapore is so tiny, the government actually didn't want to have any cars on the road. So car ownership is taxed very highly to discourage people from owning a car. And in return, they run the public transport system very well. In fact, they run it as a non-for-profit. So they're not trying to make any profit through their public transport system. They just want everyone to be able to get to work as quickly and easily, comfortably as they possibly can. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the public transport system, once again, there's a link in the description below. Just like the public transport, taxis are another subsidized thing here in Singapore to help you get around cheaper and easier. So you can either hail a cab in the street just like you would in any other country, or there's also Grab and GoJet. These are two apps that can help you get around, and you don't even need a bank account, much unlike Uber where you might need to plug in your credit card. There is an option on these apps where you can just order a simple taxi and they'll come to you and they'll take you to where you want to go. So like I mentioned earlier, cars are extremely expensive here because of the high tax rates. But it's actually more than just the taxation on the car. So every single car comes with a registration certificate, which only lasts 10 years. Now that's 10 years for a new car. So interestingly, if you walk down the streets of Singapore and you look at the cars, you'll notice that none of the cars are older than 10 years. They do give exceptions for vintage cars. I think there's a special certificate you can get for these. There are a few beautiful old cars around, but the vast majority are relatively new vehicles. Every single car is fitted with a cash card mechanism, which is basically a small grey box which allows you to go through tolled roads as well as pay for parking. So you can drive straight into any parking lot and the money will be deducted. Once again, this is relatively inexpensive. It's just something you need inside your car to be able to drive most of the roads here in Singapore. One thing you're going to want to know about before moving to Singapore is all the different social clubs. Now, there are some clubs like the British club, the American, the Swiss, and so much more. You don't necessarily have to be that nationality to join, and there are different sporting clubs and associations. It's worth looking up all of them, see what's on offer. Some have events like movie nights and drinking and comedy nights. There's literally so much on offer here. Also, you can join local clubs. You might want to consider joining a local sporting club. It can be really fun to get to know the locals, hang out, even become friends with them, because they can teach you so much about Singapore and all of the hidden gems. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope it's been helpful in helping you either move to Singapore or helping you decide whether you should move to Singapore. Click the link below, you'll see a blog. We touch on all of these points and more, and we go into much more detail and provide you many links such as the MRT and different social clubs so you can do more research on whether you should move to Singapore. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.
Try